Quorum, and we have conversation in the Conservative benches still. So let me just go through, run a show today. We're going to suspend at, are we spending or adjourning? We're adjourning at 9:45, and we're going to traipse over to room 420 to meet up with the Finnish delegation. And then the Foreign Affairs Committee is going to join us, and we will have a conversation with the Finnish delegation, which will last as long as, frankly, members want it to last. But in the meanwhile, we actually have a bit of extra time in the first hour, which has now become the hour and 15 minutes. We're waiting for Dr. Byers to come in, but we'll just proceed with Dr. Steer, who and then we'll sound check Dr. Byers when he arrives. So I'm hoping to get to 3 rounds. We'll see how it plays out after 2 rounds, and with that, we'll ask Dr. Cassandra Steer, Chair of the Australian Centre for Space Governance, coming to us by video conference. So thank you for making yourself available. 5 minutes, please.
Good morning, Chair, and thank you so much for the invitation to contribute to this study. My work in space security and space law and space governance spans Australia and North America, and I'm particularly interested in what space middle powers can achieve, particularly when they collaborate together and also work with smaller blocks or blocks of smaller nations. So I'll focus on 4 things. The first is the implications of the commercialization of space. The second is how Canada can, and in fact already does, lead in bringing a gender lens to space security. The third is geopolitical impacts on space. And the fourth, if time allows, is why having a national space policy is essential. And I know others have spoken to that. So firstly, the implications of the commercialization of space. We really need to think about space and space-based services a little bit all the time, a bit the way that we all think about cyber and cybersecurity, a little bit all the time. We're all conscious of how much cyberspace permeates our lives. We're all conscious that we need to have strong passwords and protect our personal information. And we all understand the risks of cyber attacks and the need for cybersecurity for national security. And that's how we need to think about space a little bit as well all the time. It's permeating, it's ubiquitous. These space-based services are a part of our daily personal lives and a part of national economic well-being as well as our national security. So it's still fairly early in the morning. You've probably used space at least 10 times this morning. And by this evening, you probably will have used it 20 to 40 times. That's how permeating it is. So space defense is important because space is important to Canada. I'm not sure if others have spoken to this, but I think it's useful to also understand that space systems are made up of 4 segments. So there's the space segment, obviously the satellite or the spacecraft that's in space. There's the ground segment, which is satellite dishes, receivers, and then the data processing. There's the link segment, which is the communication link between satellites and the ground segment. That's providing data or the way that we operate the satellites. And the link segment is actually the most vulnerable to threats and interferences. And then the 4th segment is the human segment. So you and I, as users of space and the operators of space and decision makers. So I think it's quite useful when we talk about space defense to really understand that all of these systems matter to us on Earth, and that in fact, 3 of those segments are not even in space. And then it's also, as others have already stated to this committee, it's important to understand the degree to which the majority of space services are dual use. So a single space system is providing the same services, communications, navigation, both for military uses and civilian uses. And this is largely because of how commercialized space has become. There are approximately 10,000 operational satellites in orbit today. 75% of those are commercially owned. And only about 580 of them are dedicated military satellites. So space as a service has become the modus operandus. DND, like many militaries around the world, is purchasing space services from commercial providers. Last month in Ottawa, I co-led a workshop that was funded by DND, which was delivered by a consulting company I work with called SSCL, Space Strategies Consulting Limited. The workshop was titled Defending and Protecting Commercial Space Services in Times of Tension and Conflict. And we discussed the need for clear contractual terms when it comes to protections that commercial space providers need to build into their own systems. We discussed the threats faced by commercial systems from adversaries. And then importantly, the implications on civilians when there's a loss of service because of those kinds of threats and interferences. And there'll be a report coming out early next year about that. So this leads to my second point, which is how Canada can lead in bringing a gender lens to space security. There's globally recognised evidence that girls and women suffer disproportionately during armed conflict for a range of reasons. And then because of the dual use nature of those commercial space services, if there's a loss of service because of an attack, that impacts not only the armed forces depending on them, but also civilians who depend on those same services. And that often leads to disproportionate impacts for women and girls. So one example is when Russia undertook a cyber attack against a US commercial Viasat satellite in 2022. But as well, Earth observation capabilities, communications capabilities, they can be deployed in a positive way in fulfillment of Canada's obligations under the UN Women, Peace and Security agenda to protect women's and girls' rights during armed conflict. And Canada's been very proactive in advocating for gender-neutral language in UN security, space security discussions and submissions on including a gender lens in space security. And there's an opportunity for D&D to advance this agenda explicitly in its space strategy and as part of its standard operating procedures, and also to partner with countries like the US and Australia who are very keen to advance that agenda. So my time is very short. I'll speak very briefly to the third point. Given that this study includes the impacts of advancements in space of Canada's sovereignty and national security, it's important to understand the geopolitical drivers behind those advancements in space. And I think in its simplest terms, space is just another domain in which geopolitics are playing out. So the tensions we see playing out regionally and globally, they are playing out in this technological domain as well. And this is exactly why space diplomacy is so important. Canada has an international reputation in being an effective space diplomat. It works together with allies and partners, including smaller nations, to advance the agenda of responsible behaviours at UN discussions in Geneva and in New York. It was the first country to join the US in committing not to test direct descent anti-satellite weapons. And it's also very much recognised for bringing clarity on the international law applicable to space security in those international discussions. So I will leave my final point on the need for national space policy. Suffice to say that I join others in advocating for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spear. And we'll take a moment while we sound check Dr. Byers.
Hello, Dr. Byers. This is Andrew Wilson, the clerk, speaking to you. Thanks for joining.
Good to see you again, Dr. Byers. 5 minutes, please.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Byers. I have held the Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law for 2 decades now. I co-direct the Outer Space Institute, which is a global network of experts working on cutting-edge challenges in near-Earth space. And also of great relevance to this committee, I co-direct the Space Security Network, which is a D&D funded MINDS network, their academic network funding, that deals with cutting-edge issues concerning space security as it relates to Canada and Canada's national defense. So I'm delighted to be here on this specific topic. It's exactly what I am working on right now. I have 2 simple points, which I will elaborate on briefly. The first is that satellites will always be much easier to attack than to defend. They are acutely vulnerable. And secondly, that Canada has several space companies that have satellite systems in orbit right now that are being used to support the Ukrainian military in an armed conflict with Russia. Nothing that I'm telling you is secret. It's all public domain information. It's things that you need to know. So satellites in terms of vulnerability, in November 2021, Russia destroyed a defunct Soviet-era satellite at 483 kilometers above Earth to demonstrate its ability to use ground-based missiles against satellites. It created a lot of debris. It put both astronauts and cosmonauts on the International Space Station at some risk from collisions from debris, but Russia demonstrated its ability to do that. Russia has been jamming satellite transmissions extensively for the last 2 years across Eastern Europe, from Ukraine all the way up to the northern border between Norway and Russia. On the morning of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, Viasat, a U.S. company that was providing communication support to the Ukrainian military, suffered a massive cyber attack, went dark on the morning of the invasion. I could go on. Even complex systems involving thousands of satellites like SpaceX's Starlink are vulnerable to all of system attacks, including a Cold War weapon called the November 2021 test right in the middle of the constellation would cause SpaceX to have to engage in tens of thousands of collision avoidance maneuvers, thus rendering the system dysfunctional. So satellites are not something that we actually can defend, which is why things like space diplomacy are so incredibly important, to remind Russia, to remind China that we all are acutely vulnerable to things like debris in space, and that irresponsible behavior hurts everyone. The second point, and this again is public record. We know because shortly after the Russian full-scale intervention that the CEO of MDA, Canada's largest space company, issued a press release saying that MDA was providing synthetic aperture radar imagery to support the Ukrainian military. Incredibly useful imagery, can produce high-resolution images at night through clouds, track Russian tank movements at night, and that's fine. It's been a really important part of Canada's contribution to the Ukrainian effort. Telesat, which operates communication satellites from geosynchronous orbit, it was revealed by the then defense minister that Telesat had a contract from the Canadian government to provide communication support to the Ukrainian military, and one can presume that that's ongoing. As Dr. Steer said, this is quite normal. Lots of satellites are dual use. Lots of governments contract with commercial operators. But the challenge is that by engaging in this kind of support, arguably, these Canadian companies are making their satellites legitimate targets under the laws of war, and therefore potentially implicating Canada in a role in the conflict that we might not want. We've been working really hard to avoid any direct conflict with Russia. We've been working really hard to avoid triggering Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. And these satellites bring us very close to the line of actually being directly engaged in that conflict. And I would encourage members of this committee to think about how Canada should respond if, for instance, RadarSat-2, the principal satellite used by MDA to support the Ukrainian military, was in fact shot down by a Russian missile. What would that mean for Canada's involvement in the conflict? How would we respond? And the next time we get into a situation like this, what kind of considerations would we want to make when deciding whether to allow a Canadian company to engage in this kind of role? It all happened very quickly in February, March 2022. I'm not saying that the wrong decisions were made, but we found ourselves much more involved in the conflict than I think decision makers realized at the time. These are new issues, new areas. But satellites bring us very close to the front line in terms of providing support for things like targeting in conflicts that otherwise we're trying to stay out of. So with those 2 points, that we can't really defend satellites, and that some of these satellites, in the way that they are used, are bringing us into foreign armed conflicts, I'll leave it there and wait for questions from the members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Byers. And Dr. Steer, you've both given us a great deal to think about, and we're going to start off our 6-minute round with Ms. Gallant. 6 minutes, please.
Okay, Dr. Byers, NATO, as you know, struggled for a number of years to decide whether or not and what would constitute triggering Article 5. Because it's a dual use, what has there any been discussion in terms of applying Article 5 to a satellite attack?
I don't have security clearance, so I don't know whether those discussions have taken place between NATO militaries. I do know it's public record that NATO spends a lot of time on space security, and that there are Canadian officials who are based at NATO in Europe dealing with these issues. So my assumption is yes, it has been considered. I would suggest that one simple change to make that may already have been made is that if Canadian companies are going to be involved in supporting a foreign military, that they should not tell anyone about this. It was quite remarkable that the CEO of MDA issued a press release in March 2022 to announce MDA's involvement in the conflict. That was a very bad decision, with all respect to the CEO. A lot of people were scrambling, and mistakes were made in those early weeks of the Ukraine war. That was a mistake. It put a big bullseye on the side of a $1 billion satellite, a $1 billion Canadian satellite that not only supports military operations, but a whole range of civilian operations, everything from ice navigation in the Canadian Arctic to climate change research. I mean, the list goes on and on. The problem with dual-use satellites is that if you lose one because of involvement in an armed conflict, not only do you risk an escalation of the conflict, but you also lose all the incredibly important civilian uses of that piece of equipment. So again, answer to the question is, I assume it's been talked about. I am not allowed to know.
Okay, so Dr. Byers, were you to have security clearance and you did know the answer to my question, would you be able to share it with this committee?
No, of course not.
Is that?
Well, because the records of this committee, the transcript of this evidence is public domain.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Byers. Are there any emergency preparedness measures aside from redundancy in space? Are there measures in place ready to execute to protect the Canadian public should there be a hostile attack on one of our satellites?
Thank you for the question. My first point about the fact that satellite systems are always easier to attack than to defend actually goes to the point of redundancy in space. I don't think redundancy in space is much of a protection, at least in terms of having hundreds or thousands of satellites in a single system spread around in a single orbital shell. So one of the recommendations that my colleague Aaron Boley and I have made to the Department of National Defense and other NATO militaries is that they distribute their satellite systems across multiple altitudes to spread them out, to make them less vulnerable. So that is one simple answer to this problem. In terms of our vulnerability in terms of day-to-day operations of civilian and military systems in Canada, we should keep non-satellite systems operating. So to give you a simple example, we are incredibly dependent on global positioning satellites. The American GPS system is central to the Canadian economy, to the point that airliners, commercial airliners, are heavily dependent on GPS, and for reasons I don't understand, we are removing the ground-based air navigation systems that used to exist before GPS, so that more and more we don't have a backup. And so if Russia or another hostile state were to somehow take down a GPS or interrupt its operations through some kind of jamming system or some kind of in-space attack, we would have a total catastrophe in terms of civilian aviation in Canada. So don't take out those ground-based systems. We have redundancies. Don't take out the fiber optic cables because you're relying on satellite systems. The more that we have different kinds of systems in different places, providing redundancy, the better we will be protected, not just against hostile attacks, but something like a massive solar storm that could also take out thousands of satellites. So let's keep the ground-based systems in place. Don't think that we can save money by removing them and just relying on satellites.
Okay, so I'll bring that clip out next time my family complains about my map collection. When the Outer Space Treaty is violated, what types of actions can be taken to ameliorate this?
Well, the question applies to all of international law. International law is respected, followed 99.9% of the time, and sometimes you get a bad actor that chooses to violate a rule, to violate a treaty. In the case of Russia, Russia is now a pariah state. It's subject to widespread sanctions. It's facing NATO providing massive amounts of weapons and other support to Ukraine as Ukraine fights its defensive battle. Russia is paying a price for its illegalities, not just with regards to the Outer Space Treaty, but with regards to things as simple as the United Nations Charter and the prohibition on the use of force.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the answer there, Ms. Glond. Mr. Collins, 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and good morning, and welcome to our witnesses. Dr. Byers, I'll start with you in terms of space debris. I was formerly a member of our science committee and wanted to undertake a study on space debris. And what I found fascinating with that subject is that many of the agreements that govern space are decades old. They were nation to nation when they were signed in the 60s and 70s. And not a lot has changed in terms of updating those agreements or signing new multilateral agreements that would address not just space debris, but other governance-related matters in space. The question that I have for you is, you've talked about, some of the issues that the threats that are posed to our commercial infrastructure that's in space, as well as our military infrastructure in space when it comes to space debris. And I'm just wondering what recommendations you have for the committee as it relates to possibly updating those agreements or continuing along the line of tacit agreements that are in place, soft agreements, that kind of govern this whole issue related to space debris and how we deal with it. And then I have a supplemental question related to the same, but I'll ask you that first.
That's actually a very tough question. Thank you for it. You're right. The major multilateral treaties concerning space were all negotiated and adopted in the 1960s and the 1970s and have proven remarkably resilient. But they've been supplemented by lots and lots of cooperation. So, for instance, in Canada, we're heavily reliant on a satellite-based search and rescue systems called COSPAS-SARSAT. It was created in 1979 at the height of the Cold War in partnership with the Soviet Union, with France, the United States, and saves thousands of lives worldwide each year. Russia and China are still participating in that system. There is space station. Indeed, an American astronaut launched on a Russian Soyuz rocket from Kazakhstan just a few months ago as an evidence of that continued cooperation. And internationally at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, there's still cooperation taking place. Canadian diplomats playing a central role, I should say. We have very effective diplomatic representation at United Nations bodies dealing with space. So at that level, things are actually pretty good. With regards to space debris specifically, there are two things that people need to realize. First of all, you can't avoid space debris. Our tracking systems, our radar systems, our telescope systems can only detect pieces of debris that are, roughly 8 centimeters across or larger. And there are millions and millions of pieces that are too small to detect, all going at 17,000 kilometers an hour. A piece the size of a paint flex can destroy $1 billion satellite. So you can't avoid space debris, and you can't clean it up. You can clean up the big pieces, not the small pieces. At least theoretically, you could clean up the big pieces. But as a result of this, there is a situation of mutually assured destruction in low Earth orbit, where you have all this debris. Any country, any actor that engaged in an action that created tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of additional pieces of debris would be putting its own satellites at severe risk. And so there is a self-interest in avoiding catastrophic collisions, the use of anti-satellite missiles on the part of those states that are heavily dependent on space. So the United States, China, European countries, Canada, even Russia have a very strong interest in avoiding the creation of much more debris. My big concern to the future is that there are countries that are not very dependent on space that are acquiring the capacity to cause a lot of debris in space. And I'm thinking about Iran, and I'm thinking about North Korea. When North Korea develops the ability to launch 500,000 steel pellets into low Earth orbit to create a pellet ring, we have a serious problem. So this is all part of arms control. It's part of our attempt to restrain rogue nations like Iran and North Korea. We do it with nuclear weapons.
Dr.
We
Byers,
need to now do it with regards to space.
Sorry, I think I have just less than a minute left. I would like to ask about, you said, I've read some of your stuff, and you talked about it's just a matter of time within the next decade that it's likely someone on Earth will be killed by debris that's re-entering the atmosphere. I read an article earlier that Saskatchewan farm had SpaceX equipment fall onto a field, thankfully, and no one was injured. Florida family had a piece of space asset that was through their roof and into their living room, I think. Can you talk about how a space policy should address these issues, knowing that we really have no guardrails right now that protects people around the world from some of the infrastructure that's finding its way back to Earth?
So a year ago, the Outer Space Institute partnered with the International Civil Aviation Organization to look into the risk to commercial airliners from re-entering space debris. And a piece of debris that is just 300 grams could fatally damage a Boeing 777 or an Airbus 350. And so 300 people could die as a result of a collision with a piece of space debris re-entering through Earth's atmosphere. Extremely low probability, very high consequence. And so how do you reduce the risk? Well, one of the ways you reduce the risk is that you stop launch providers from abandoning rocket stages in orbit after they engage in a launch. You require that they engage in what's called a controlled reentry and put that rocket body into the South Pacific Ocean, where it doesn't pose a risk to anyone. So we've been advocating for a controlled reentry regime. I know that the U.S. Space Force will now only contract for a launch if the company can assure them that the rocket stages will come back in a controlled way and go into the ocean.
Unfortunately, sorry to keep interrupting, but unfortunately we're having to, this is a 6-minute round, not a 10-minute round. Madame Normandine is next. She will speak en français. So if you make sure your computers are set to the translation mode if you need it. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Merci aux deux témoins.
Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for coming. I will try to alternate my questions. I'll begin with Ms. Steers. You talked about the importance of having a technology that is required for space. We need to be able to detect when there's re-entry through a computer system. To what extent should the citizen be aware? Is it at the same level as as a citizen, I can be a risk for an attack or whatever.
Respond in English. It's just better for everybody. But I think it's very important to understand that, in fact, cyber attacks are the greatest risk to space systems. So the direct ascent anti-satellite weapons that Michael Byers mentioned, there's only 4 countries that have demonstrated that capability, and it's a highly unlikely kind of interference precisely because of the debris it creates and the risk that creates to their own capabilities. So cyber attacks and other forms of link segment interference like jamming and sending a false spoofing signal, those things are happening every single day already. In terms of the risk of a citizen becoming a vector in that risk is very low. We're not likely to accidentally interfere with that link, but we are at risk of losing out on the service when there are those cyber attacks. So again, the example of Russia launching a cyber attack on the US Viasat satellite in 2022 deliberately and had the desired effect of interfering with communications for the Ukrainian forces, but also all Ukrainian citizens and many citizens in neighboring countries as well. So I think there needs to be a greater level of awareness of that. I advocate a lot for space literacy. I do a lot of executive education to Australian government and together with SSCL for Canadian government. There's a space fundamentals course that you all can take to get a greater understanding of what those risks are. So as individuals, there's probably not a lot we can do in terms of cyber hygiene or protection, but there's a great deal we can do in terms of raising the understanding of the risks and our uses of those space systems.
Merci beaucoup. Une question pour...
Thank you. A question for you, Dr. Byers. I will piggyback on my colleague Gallant's question. She referred to Article 5 and cyber attacks. Cyber attacks seems to be less of a problem with satellites, but in terms of the damage that can be imposed through a satellite attack, I'd like to hear what you have to say. We knew that cyber attacks against critical infrastructure systems can lead to loss of life, can deal with water treatment, other things. What about attacks for critical infrastructure?
Merci beaucoup pour la question. Again, I will respond in English just because it's better for everyone. The first thing to realize is that invoking Article 5 is a decision that NATO states will make. So if there were an attack on, let's say, a Canadian commercial satellite like RadarSat-2, one of the first decisions that the Canadian government would have to make is whether they would treat this as an armed attack that would trigger the NATO obligation. And my guess is that in the situation involving a single satellite, that we would not invoke Article 5. It would be an attack on an important piece of Canadian infrastructure, but it would not be an attack within Canadian territory, and we would be conscious that invoking Article 5 would signal that we were to a direct conflict with a nuclear armed state, which would seem to me highly undesirable. So it's a self-judging invocation. That's the first thing to say. The consequences, however, could be very serious. RadarSat-2 is the principal source of revenue for Canada's largest space company. I don't know whether their bottom line could handle losing such an important revenue generating piece of equipment. And then there are all the users who make use of RadarSat-2. Everything from oil companies using the imagery to monitor pipelines, looking for slumping of ground, looking for erosion problems around their equipment, their operations in remote areas, to Canadian Coast Guard icebreakers navigating the Northwest Passage, trying to avoid multi-year ice. And the list goes on and on and on. So yes, it would be a very serious thing in terms of being just as important as a piece of critical infrastructure located on the ground here in Canada.
Si je peux vous demander de
Could you please specify when we talk about human life? I do understand the economic side of a cyber attack, but what about human life?
RADARSAT-2, there would be some implications in terms of our ability to do things like sea ice monitoring, which enables us to resupply Arctic communities. So there are some direct implications. The more serious ones, however, would come with regards to commercial satellite operations. If we think about SpaceX's Starlink constellation, it is now providing essential services across northern Canada. There are pizza box size terminals outside lots and lots of buildings in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories and the Yukon now, and we're seeing greater and greater dependence on the satellite system. Institutional subscribers have a backup. They will have a subscription to a geosynchronous satellite service, but SpaceX is becoming more and more important.
Okay.
And there are several complications of that. One of which is the vulnerability of the system.
Again, I'm having to interrupt. I apologize again. Being dependent on Elon Musk does not give me warm fuzzies. Ms. Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank both of the witnesses as well for appearing with us today. Ms. Steer, you've written at length about the need for creating binding international agreements to prevent the militarization of space. And the need to specifically prevent the testing of direct ascent anti-satellite missile systems. So we've seen other nations, Russia, the U.S., India, they've tested these systems. So can you talk about the impact of why it's so important to prevent future testing?
Yeah, was that question to me or to Sam?
Sorry, that was to Ms. Steer.
Thank you for the question. So Canada was, as I mentioned, the first country to join the US in committing not to test those direct ascent anti-satellite weapons, or DAASATs. We now have 37 countries around the world who've made that unilaterally binding commitment, that under international law, when a state makes a unilateral statement like that, it is binding upon itself. On top of that, we have UN General Assembly, where I think there's something like 130-something countries that voted in favor of the notion of a moratorium on testing those DAASATs. That doesn't mean that they're then bound. That's a political expression. As to whether or not we need to have a binding treaty on that, I mean, those are exactly the discussions ongoing right now. In fact, this very week at the UN in New York, and there will be a new open-ended working group that will look at what kind of non-binding agreements can we come up with, so norms of behaviour, and is there a potential to have a treaty that might prohibit it? I'm actually of the mind that a treaty is not necessarily the outcome that we want. The point is, as Dr. Byers also mentioned, the amount of debris that's created. So there's 4 countries that has tested them. In each case, there's an enormous, uncontrollable amount of debris that is created. The Chinese test in 2007 still has some debris today that is in orbit. Thousands of pieces of debris created, and these things are moving at 7 kilometers per second in low Earth orbit. And as Dr. Byers said, something the size of a fleck of paint can be lethal to a satellite. It's uncontainable. So one of the reasons I don't think that a treaty is necessary is that the laws of international armed conflict will tell us if we are in an armed conflict on Earth, it is prohibited to use non-indiscriminate weapons, and there is an impossibility in determining what the impact will be of creating that amount of debris on all of the satellites that the world depends on. So it is by definition indiscriminate. You're not able to just target a military objective. You're also impacting civilians and civilian infrastructure. And that also goes a little bit to the questions that we've heard around what are the impacts of cyber attacks on humans and indeed on the question of would, under Article 5, an attack be considered something sufficient to trigger the Article 5 of the NATO Treaty? It all depends on the effects of those kinds of attacks. So when we're talking about DAASATs, they create debris, and it is impossible to contain the debris, so we do not know what the effects will be, but we do know that at some stage that debris is going to hit something. When it comes to cyber attacks and these non-kinetic interferences, the question is, what is the physical effect of that attack on a satellite system? Is that cutting off people's communications? Is it impacting search and rescue? Is it impacting satellite systems that actually the part of the control system of water systems for the city, for example? Or is that going to impact food security because of the dependencies on those satellite systems? So it's all about the physical effects in the real world. And we know both from how the laws of armed conflict apply to cyber and how we think they apply to space, that as soon as we have something that is sufficient in terms of its effects in the physical world, we can determine that that is sufficient to say it is an armed attack. But it is a case-by-case decision.
So in terms of that, in terms of those conversations that are continuously happening, are we adequately, though, getting to a point of holding that de-escalation when we see other nations, and this would be for both witnesses, are we doing everything, is Canada doing everything it can within those mechanisms to consistently hold on to that de-escalation specifically?
I think Canada's doing an outstanding job in that sense. And this is what I said in the beginning of my opening comments about the important role of middle powers. Canada is recognised as a very strong space diplomat. It took a very active part in the first open-ended working group that ran for 2 years. It was also one of just 22 nations that took part in a group of governmental experts, which just closed off earlier this year and came up with a consensus report, which was no small achievement. The open-ended working group was unable to come out with any kind of consensus report, even one simply stating we met on these dates and these countries took part, because it became politicized. To be frank, Russia refused to agree on any consensus to release a report. But we did get to a consensus report in that smaller group of governmental experts, and Canada was one of the countries that worked very hard to achieve that. I would highly recommend you all read that report. It's not very long. It goes into whether or not we need to have binding treaties, or whether we can, and can we also keep working on non-binding norms of behaviour to indeed de-escalate. Canada's doing an outstanding job. Right now there's a proposal to have 2 new open-ended working groups, one focusing on treaties, one focusing on non-binding norms, and that is just going to completely dilute the process and make it impossible for smaller nations to participate that don't have large enough delegations to take part in 2 parallel processes. So Canada's working very hard with a lot of other countries. The vote will take place next week in New York as to whether or not those 2 open-ended working groups can be merged into one. I think one other thing Canada does exceptionally well is the kind of corridor diplomacy and behind closed doors diplomacy, where they do work with smaller nations to make sure there's shared understanding and to strategize about how to really push that vote forward to get a single open-ended working group, and outside of the UN multilateral discussions as well, to keep working together with other nations. Space literacy, space
Going to have to,
building.
unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it again there. Mr. Allison, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question, I want to talk a bit about AI, and I realize that that's not necessarily specifically your people's areas of expertise, but I would love to get your thoughts. And so to you, Dr. Steer, what do you think about the developments in artificial intelligence in the defense sector as it relates to space?
I think this is something that is not gaining sufficient attention, to be quite honest. Satellite systems are more and more dependent on AI for various aspects. Some of it is just about the data processing. So Earth observation satellites are gathering enormous amounts of data. AI is used to process some of that data. But if that's being used to then feed into military decision-making, we need to know that there's sufficient trust in those decision-making models and those automated models. A lot of the space traffic management is dependent on AI. So again, over 10,000 operational satellites and well over 130 million pieces of debris, some of which, as Dr. Byers said, is too small for us to even track. So AI is increasingly used as a space traffic management tool to have satellites perform collision avoidance maneuvers and to try and predict where there might be collisions. And all of this is really necessary because of the physical speed in space, the amount of data that we're using, and our dependencies on satellites. But I don't think there's sufficient understanding about what risks that brings, particularly, again, if that's going to feed into military decision-making for targeting, for navigation of one's own troops on land, at sea, or in the air, for communications, for understanding the movements of adversaries. AI is becoming more and more a part of that decision-making chain, and when it's built into satellite systems, we don't have enough opportunities, I think, or enough proactive mechanisms for those working on the AI systems and those who are space experts to really be bringing those two worlds together. There are high risks, I think.
Thank you. So I'll continue the question then. So as AI continues to grow, certainly in all aspects of our lives and military and space, so let's talk a bit about cybersecurity as it relates to that. I mean, do you think Canada is ready to tackle some of these challenges in this complex world of AI?
I mean, I think that's a question we could pose to every country. Yes and no for the reasons that I just said. But I do think that there are strengths, and this goes to the more kind of what can we be doing to defend and protect satellite systems, whether those are commercial or sovereign, is that and one of the challenges is that the competition for the skill set. So the people with the technical understanding are probably going to take jobs in the private sector where they're higher paid. It's hard to get them to come into government jobs, civilian or military. So that is one challenge. And I think, my fear is none of us are really fully prepared, but I think we really need to be bringing those worlds together. We need cyber experts, AI experts, space technology experts, and then the governance experts of those different areas all working in the room together.
Thank you. So next question is, in what ways do you think government then can maybe create the advantage for Canada when it comes to technology in terms of AI? So what kind of ways can the government do a better job in order to take advantage of this?
Unfortunately, I think it comes back to procurement, which I know is also an issue this committee has heard a lot about. But when you have relatively small companies in space, in AI, and in cybersecurity, and probably cybersecurity, they do better at this, but certainly in space and AI, oftentimes the government wants to see those companies demonstrate the technology readiness level of their capabilities by having other clients first. But that's a near impossibility. Those kinds of capabilities, they're only going to find other clients if the government has already procured their capabilities. It has to go the other way around. So the government has to be prepared to be the first client, and that's difficult when there are low appetites for risk. But I think given the speed of these technologies, that's just something that somehow the government is going to have to become prepared to do.
Yeah, and I think the U.S. is a good example. I mean, they are always there making sure that they invest in their technology. So I think that's probably not a bad example. Maybe just the last question here then. So if we start looking at investing money into AI in particular, or AI infrastructure, is there any particular investments you would recommend as a starting point, or would be more important than others to get going on as far as when it comes to technology, artificial intelligence, infrastructure? Where would you think would be a great place to start?
Yeah, I'd have to admit that I wouldn't have sufficient expertise to say what areas of AI in particular, but what I could comment on more is perhaps the mechanisms to do that, because I don't think the government itself has to then become an expert in AI technologies either. What it needs to have in place is mechanisms to be able to test those out. So one example, again, from the US is it has a, I forget what the acronym stands for now, the CASO. So it's about bringing commercial space providers into the defense architecture in a way that they can start to test out and model these capabilities before they decide whether or not to buy them. That helps the commercial providers to understand what the military's needs are, what defense's needs are. It helps defense to understand where the technologies already are at and what the limitations might be, as well as the opportunities. And together they can move towards potential solutions. So I think mechanisms like that are going to help to solve it.
Thank you, Mr. Allison. Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here to answer some of our questions on this really important topic. I'll start with Dr. Byers. You spoke about how satellites bring us close to the front line when it comes to wars, and you spoke about how there's one satellite in particular that Canada is currently using for its war efforts to help Ukraine. I'm wondering if Russia were to do anything to interfere with that, would it not be considered an act of war? And if so, would it not be like an attack on NATO? I'm wondering what your thoughts are here.
Thank you. That is the Article 5 issue that we discussed 20 minutes ago. It could be characterized ground-based missile that was launched from Russia.
Sorry, we lost you for a good few seconds there. Would you?
Yeah, this is the Article 5 issue, which is self-judging, that Canada could characterize such an action as an act of war, as an armed attack, or could choose not to. There would be an attribution issue with regards to some kinds of attacks, not with regards to others. A ground-based missile launched from Russia would quite clearly be attributable. But again, my point is that we need to think hard in advance. We give permission to satellite companies to provide such support in a foreign armed conflict, whether we are prepared to be making these tough decisions later. Like, do we want to be in a direct conflict with a nuclear armed state because we gave permission to a Canadian satellite company to provide support to frontline operations in a foreign armed conflict? That's the question. It's a policy question. We need to get in front of this, decide what are our criteria for giving permission to Canadian companies to support foreign militaries.
Well, I understand. Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Steer, I guess you could both weigh in on this a little bit. Just it's a point of clarification, and I'm just wondering if you can help me understand a little bit better. You said that generally, if an attack is made on one satellite, there are perhaps repercussions on others. Is that what I understood? Is it possible for a country to only attack one satellite and not have fear that it would affect its own as well?
So it really depends on the vector of attack, and this is why it's important to understand space systems of being made up of those 4 segments. So if it is a kinetic physical attack on one satellite, then our concern is, what is the debris going to do to other satellites in space? But in fact, as I mentioned, the much greater threats are ground-based and link-based. So the jamming a communications satellite link, spoofing and sending a false navigational link so you don't know where you are, or you don't know where your adversaries are, or you don't know where your target is. Or dazzling an Earth observation satellite so it can't gather the information it's trying to gather, and cyber attacks. So these non-physical, non-kinetic attacks are much more prevalent, much more useful, in fact, and much harder to attribute. So they're also much more effective in times of tension and warfare. In those senses, you're often attacking a different part of the system than just a satellite. The reason people keep talking about distributed architecture and what SpaceLink has done is because when you have many, many, many satellites, it no longer matters if you target one single satellite or one single link, because the other satellites can take the place of that and the service can continue to be provided. So the more complex you make your architecture, the harder it is to attack, which is actually a defensive mode. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. You gave a lot of good information there. I appreciate that. And then I would like to ask you another question, Dr. Steer. You spoke about the fact that women are disproportionately impacted when it comes to armed conflict, and that we should be thinking about this when looking at space and how we're dealing with that. Can you give us a little bit more in terms of how this helps us understand space a little bit differently? Can you give us what recommendations you would have for Canada to take on in order to make sure that we're moving that agenda forward?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the question. So because of the dual-use nature of all of these systems, because civilians are impacted when a dual-use system is targeted, we have to think about what are the impacts on civilians. And often in many conflict situations, women and girls are already, for example, denied access to school. So their only access to schooling might be through having access to internet. They might lose absolute communications with each other as family units during a conflict situation. They might lose access to be able to navigate to sources of water, for example. And in cases where women and girls are being physically targeted with gender-based violence and sexual violence, Earth observation satellites can help to gather timely, real-time evidence and information that would then aid Canadian troops to intervene. So it's both about how they're impacted negatively and also about how we can use space systems to positively ensure that Canada is implementing what its obligations are under its National Action Plan for the UN Women, Peace and Security agenda. So Canada's the first country to have explicitly included space in that National Action Plan, which I think is outstanding. I think
Unfortunately, again, I'm going to have to interrupt the answer here. Madame Normandine, 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Lambropoulos.
Thank you. I have just had my question stolen by Ms. Lambropoulos. You talked about the importance of redundance, and you said that we must not get rid of land systems should there be problems with satellites. I'd like to hear you talk about two aspects. Should we maintain these ground-based systems, or should we be investing even more in these ground-based systems? And I would imagine these ground systems are already used for other purposes. Do we have a priority use system in case of an emergency? Should there be a problem with a satellite that is no longer functioning? If all of a sudden we need to look to that service.
An excellent question, and I could give dozens of examples of how we have existing redundancies and how we could build more redundancies into our system. So let me give you just a simple example. In the case of GPS, reliance on GPS, as I've mentioned, Canada and the United States are removing a lot of our ground-based air navigation systems because GPS is just as good and cheaper, and pilots are accustomed to using GPS for all kinds of operations. The problem is if GPS is offline, if it's not accurate because of a solar storm, or if there's jamming that's occurring, and it's a low visibility day at Toronto Pearson Airport, the pilots are then 100% reliant on the ground-based systems for their approaches. And if you were to take out that ground-based system, then the pilots would effectively be blind in low visibility situations. Now, no one is proposing to take the ground-based system out of Toronto Pearson Airport, but we are taking ground-based systems out of a lot of smaller airports across Canada and the United States. And on a normal day, 364 days a year, that's absolutely fine. And then the one day that the GPS is not functioning properly, perhaps because of a solar storm, the pilots are then in a more difficult situation. We want maximum safety with regards to essential functions like transportation. So you keep the ground-based systems, you provide the redundancy. Same thing with fiber optic cables. Just because we're reliant on satellites and they're absolutely fantastic, we shouldn't cancel our plans to build a fiber optic cable to Iqaluit. We should have redundant systems as much as possible. Space is great, but if you get too reliant on one domain and you lose it for whatever reason, then you're in a real pickle. And so wise policymaking is always looking to ensure backups. And that's all I'm asking for here.
Thanks very much. Ms. Masson, 2.5
Sorry,
minutes.
just to clarify, we're doing a third round as well, right?
Likely,
Hopefully.
if we're a little tight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Byers, so just to expand upon, or Dr. Byers, so to expand upon what was just said, we also then would be in risk of losing the skills in terms of the people's ability to read those, I guess you would say they call them maybe older systems or those backup systems in favor of GPS? Is the loss of like the human component of being able to understand them or read them or use them being lost as well?
Yes, presumably it is. I remember having a conversation in September 2019 with a very senior U.S. Navy official who was reporting on a NATO naval exercise that took place off the coast of Norway, where the Russians had jammed GPS throughout the NATO exercise. Now, this senior U.S. officer was pleased with that because his personnel on the U.S. Navy ships had to get out their sextants and do it the old-fashioned way in terms of navigation. So the Russians had actually improved the exercise by causing this problem, by rendering GPS unreliable through jamming. So yeah, we need to maintain the old ways. We need to, for instance, know how to navigate an oil tanker from Vancouver out into the Pacific Ocean without GPS. So we need to make sure that our ship's pilots know how to use the ground-based lighthouse systems to navigate their ships and not, become too dependent on their computer screens and their global positioning systems. But that's a general issue. As we move further and further into digital technologies, we need to make sure we don't lose the old ways of doing things, because if the internet were lost, if satellites were lost, we don't want to go back to the Stone Age. We want to go back to the 1990s.
I'm not sure what time I have left. Oh, well, I'll just say then that it would be incumbent upon the federal government to also continue to invest in lighthouses, I would assume, which they are not.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Dr. Byers, you talked about space junk and space debris, and it's something I think that's been talked about for a long time. But I'm wondering, what do the operators of spacecraft do to protect themselves from space debris? Because I'm not hearing about a lot of collisions or damage, or maybe I'm just not reading in the right publications.
Well, they do several things. First of all, they will often choose to put their satellites at altitudes that have less congestion, less debris, so that's one strategy, where you position your satellites, your satellite system. Some operators, build shielding into their satellites, build redundancies. So instead of having, just one electrical wire connecting two components, you have two electrical wires. So if that tiny paint fleck of space debris were to cut one of the wires, you'd have a backup that would keep the satellite operational. But the more shielding you put in, the more redundancies you put in, the greater the cost of your satellite. And one of the big problems today is that some operators, led by SpaceX, have adopted the consumer thousands of mass-produced, low-cost satellites with no redundancies, and then just an operational life of 4 or 5 years. So just like your cell phone, they throw it away after 4 or 5 years, send it into a reentry.
Is there a point, like a forecast point, where we're going to reach maximum saturation of artificial satellites in space?
Well, there is something called the Kessler syndrome, which hypothesizes that once you get a certain rate of collisions and debris creations, you create a kind of death spiral, a ongoing cascade of debris that eventually destroys the orbit where this is happening. And it's indeed possible that we're in the early stages of this Kessler syndrome already, that in some altitudes, some orbital shells, that we've gone beyond the carrying capacity, and we will eventually lose access. But we need to combat that by insisting that satellites are capable of withstanding small debris hits by having redundancies, by having shielding, that they're built to last. They're built for the conditions of space.
Talk about Iran for a second. You mentioned earlier that the countries that don't rely on space would be the ones most incentivized to mess up our space assets. And I think you specifically mentioned Iran. And have you heard of intelligence that's out there that Iran's actually, preparing a mission to launch these space pellets to create this pellet ring to disrupt our space communications?
No, I haven't. I don't have access to classified information, and so I just can't comment on that. I do want to seize the opportunity to say that I'm not worried about China engaging in such an attack, because China has the exact same interest that Western countries do in keeping space a safe place for their satellites. And so there's huge opportunity for diplomacy with China on this issue. And of course, we can walk and chew gum when it comes to a great power like China. We can stand fast and build up our defenses while cooperating with China on discrete issues where there is a shared interest, and this is one of them.
I wonder if I might briefly interject and say I actually don't believe there's any country on Earth that is not dependent on space capabilities. There are different levels of dependency, but I think that actually reduces the likelihood of these kinetic attacks because they will be compromising their own dependencies.
Dr. Byers, earlier you mentioned MDA's radar sat, and it's important to us and to other countries. How do we, in general, our aerospace industry, how does it compare to others on the global stage in terms of size and sophistication?
Canada was the third country in space. We had our first satellite in space in 1962, and we have legacy companies that have grown and evolved and are global players now. Telesat, with regards to communications, a world leader, currently building a very robust communications constellation in low Earth orbit that actually follows the kinds of recommendations.
For 4% of the world's economy, are we more than 4% of the space industry?
I don't know about that exact number, but I do know that we have a couple of major players, and yes, we can build more. It is a competitive environment, and these are systems that are essential for any 21st century economy. But I do want to emphasize that we do have several world leaders, and we have companies that are emerging as world leaders, like Canadensis, which is building a lunar rover for the Canadian Space Agency right now. So Telesat, MDA, Canadensis, we have some significant players. Should we have more? Of course we should have more. Is the United States ahead of us? Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Mr. Pawlowski, final 5 minutes.
So, Professor Byers, you've talked about Canadian satellite companies allowing the Ukrainian military to use its satellites, the possibility that these would become legitimate targets and bring Canada into an international conflict. And this gives rise to the policy question of whether we should allow it. I'm wondering, how much really are satellites an exception, though? Canada also produces labs that we sell or we donate to Ukraine. We produce optic systems to help Ukrainian drones. They would theoretically be perhaps a legitimate target, but I guess those would be built on Canadian soil. So if the Russians were to attack Canadian soil, that's a different thing. But we have to get them to Ukraine. So they're going to go through international waters anyhow. So isn't that a comparable kind of situation, and how much are really satellites kind of an exception in international law?
Well, let me say from the outset that I actually support the provision of satellite services from Canada to the Ukrainian military. This is a almost existential issue of international security, what's happening through the Russian invasion. So I support what's happening. My point is that I'm not sure that careful consideration was given in March 2022 as to the possible implications of allowing companies like MDA and Telesat to provide frontline support. And what I mean by frontline support is communications that's actually used in targeting, imagery that's actually used in targeting, and it creates potential risks. So not only is the satellite potentially legitimate target, so is the ground station. Where's the ground station? It's in Richmond, BC. I don't think that Russia wants to escalate the conflict by bringing NATO into a direct armed conflict. I think that's holding Russia back from targeting Western satellites like RadarSat-2. But Russian decision making is not something that we should be reliant on, right? We shouldn't be reliant on Russia exercising restraint. We should be carefully considering all of these possible implications.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Because I think I'll get to something which I think kind of follows on from this. So in terms of the policy question, Ukraine is not acting contrary to international law. Russia certainly is, violating the most fundamental principles of international law by attacking a sovereign international state, which leads me to the question, okay, the Ukrainians can and do get assistance from commercial satellites. How about the Russians? I mean, the Russians can certainly pay companies in order to use their satellites. Do we know if this is happening, and what can we do to prevent that in international public or private law?
Yeah, this is a form of export controls, and I can assure you that it's very carefully scrutinized. There have been instances in the past. So a few years ago, Iran launched a missile attack on a U.S. base in Iraq, and were reliant on imagery provided by a Western satellite company when planning their attack. Fortunately, the United States intelligence services were able to penetrate those communications and knew that the attack was coming, and were able to move most of their personnel out of harm's way. But yes, there are unscrupulous Western companies that will sell imagery or communications to anyone, and regulators need to be on top of this and monitor it and punish it when it occurs. That's an export control issue, essentially. What I'm concerned about is that we essentially have Canadian companies that are acting like private military contractors, providing support to a foreign armed conflict, and that has implications that need to be very carefully considered in advance. It would be like having a Canadian company sending mercenaries to fight on the front line in Ukraine. Would we want to approve that? What would be the possible implications? And I'm not sure that those kinds of discussions and careful policy considerations occurred in March 2022. And the next time we get into this situation, I would hope that we would have a playbook for how to analyze what is the right decision on the part of the Canadian government.
Professor Steer, do you want to interject on anything related to that? We haven't given you any time, sorry.
No, thank you so much. You asked to what extent satellites are the exception, and I think there is something different in the sense that the services they provide are not geographically limited. So if Canada provides a lab or even, sends over some explicitly military equipment, of course, that equipment itself in the course of warfare becomes a target, but it's less likely that Canadian soil becomes a target. Satellites that are in space are beyond national jurisdiction, and the services they're providing are not just within the geographical limitations of one country or one area. They're global, or they're international in any case. And the fact that they are dual use, so under the laws of armed conflict, you can only target a military objective, you cannot target a civilian object. But if something is providing services both for military and civilian purposes, it probably is a legitimate target. The next question that has to be asked, though, is what is the proportionality of the means of interfering with that service? And what are the implications then going to be for civilians? That's the whole point of the laws of armed conflict.
Unfortunately, again, I'm having to cut people off. I sort of feel badly, but I don't.
It's your job.
So, colleagues, we've got 15 minutes, and we got 25 minutes worth of questions on a third round. I'm assuming we want to go to a third round. So, 3 minutes, Mr. Bazan.
Thank you. So my question's to Dr. Steer. You had mentioned a group of 22 nations that worked together to produce a report. Now we should read it. What was that report again?
That is the group of governmental experts that met under the banner of the UN to discuss the advancement of the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And the report came out just in August of this year.
We'll make sure that our analysts find it and circulate that. Secondly, you said there's 22 nations that are part of that?
That's right. It's a closed group. So the open-ended working group is every country that's part of the UN can participate. The group of governmental experts is a selected closed group, and Canada was one of the countries.
Okay. Out of our adversaries, was China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea members of that group?
China and Russia both were, yes.
Oh, yeah, it was Taiwan. They should be. now, Australia, you come from Australia, you're in kind of an advantageous position of being a member of AUKUS. And we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about quantum computing, we talk about machine learning, and cybersecurity. Now, is AUKUS Pillar 2 also going to be digging in on providing those types of capabilities to space assets by the 3 nations that are currently members of AUKUS?
So that is what a lot of us who understand how these technologies intersect are really hoping for. I think AUKUS was put together in a great rush. To be quite frank, the entire Australian government knew nothing about it until the public announcement was made by the Prime Minister. Like, it was not taken through the proper procedures, and I think everyone just went nuclear submarines. And it's only later that we've started to really try and unfold what does this mean for all the other kinds of technological dependencies and potential capability opportunities there are. So yes, it will fall under Pillar 2, but that's taken a great deal of advocacy and work from a lot of different sectors.
Okay, both of you as witnesses have talked about the danger in turning satellites into space junk and the vulnerabilities that creates and the existential threat to life here on Earth. However, the big concern that we've had at this committee is the use of EMP, electronic magnetic pulse, and how that can take out, and definitely there'd be collateral damage to infrastructure of existing nations. But a country I would think like North Korea or Iran, which has limited space capabilities, using an EMP would have little detrimental impact upon their own nations, and they would look at and take the calculation that it would be greatly damaging to Western democracies. So is there a way to defend against that? And if so, how?
So I actually take a bit of a critical stance on the assertion that that is likely, because I think we can't underestimate just how dependent, as I said, every country is. So they may not have their own satellites in space, but not does Australia have sovereign satellites in space. We have some commercial ones, but our internet, our telecommunications, our navigation, it is a part of our everyday lives, even in countries where, even in developing countries and even in these countries where people have concerns about their political motivations. So I think the risk of them bombing space back to the Stone Age is actually quite low. That said, we can't predict, political decisions. They might be willing to take a bigger risk.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Ms. Lalonde, 3 minutes.
I think it's Mrs.
Madame
Lapointe. Professor Byers, my writing is Sudbury, and it's a mining town, so all things mining are of interest to me. And your book, Who Owns Outer Space, which is a great title, by the way, explains that the 1967 Outer Space Treaty says exploration and resources of space should be shared by all people on Earth, but space mining is a challenging legal framework. Can you elaborate on this issue?
Yes, it's my interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty that it does not actually address the issue as to whether commercial space mining is allowed or not allowed, that issue was left until later. And fair enough, it was 1967. But that issue is the centerpiece of some pretty important international diplomacy right now. And it's not just as to whether commercial space mining is allowed, but if it is allowed, then what are the restrictions on that? What are the necessary safety and security considerations? How do you coordinate between different actors, for instance, on the moon? So that's at the heart of diplomacy these days. There is a working group at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space that's engaged in a multilateral investigation of this very issue. Canada has a lot that it can bring to the table, our expertise in terrestrial mining, obviously, our expertise in multilateral diplomacy, of finding compromise, of bringing everyone to an agreement in what is a consensus-based organization. I just want to use this opportunity, however, to point out that mining in space will be 1,000 times more difficult than mining on the surface of the planet. And so the safety and security elements of this issue of space mining are something that need to be front and center. lest we get caught up in the excitement about the possible economic benefits. There's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of hype with regards to space mining. And I would like to remind people that this is an extremely dangerous, difficult environment, extreme distances, the vacuum of space, challenges like lunar dust alone make me hesitate about a lot of the proposals we hear about. There will be a future for space mining one day, but it's not coming quickly, despite what a lot of entrepreneurs would want you to believe.
You mentioned the importance of diplomacy in your response. So with the increasing discussions that we're having around space as a potential military domain, what policies or diplomatic measures would you advise Canada to support to prevent that weaponization of space? And how do you see Canada engaging with allies to promote space as a peaceful domain while ensuring national security?
I don't want to imply any criticism of Canada's diplomats. I do think they're doing an exceptional job in this domain. But there are some things I would like to see more of, and one is engagement with China and India on these issues. India is also a significant space power. We obviously have difficult relations with China and India on other issues, but we have shared interests with regards to space. And diplomacy isn't about talking with your friends, it's about talking with your adversaries. It's about finding opportunities and compromise. And as a middle power, those kinds of bilateral and track two conversations with China and India could help to move this ball down the field.
Okay,
Again,
I'm
not easy.
Sorry to keep interrupting here. 90 seconds, Madame Normandine.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Steer.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Ms. Steer. We talked about the consequences of attacks, but are the forums adequate to prevent accidents between allied countries? Is this something is flying under the radar, or do we talk about it?
Discussion about the need for transparency and communication about particular activities in space, particularly as we see more counter space operations, so satellites being able to sidle up to each other either to repair them or interfere with them. And so the need to communicate intent and have transparency and confidence building measures precisely to avoid, if that's what you meant by accidental interferences or misreadings of what those activities are.
Et advenant, par exemple, qu'il y a des litiges
should there be lawsuits that may be in the public domain or in the defense domain? Do we have forum to get through this? Do allied countries participate in this adequately?
Sufficient forums for that? I mean, I think there are more and more discussions about we need to have points of contact. We need to have better sharing of information about space debris and space objects, but there isn't sufficient international governance around this. There's a lot of discussions to try and advance that, both in the UN multilaterally, also bilaterally and minilaterally, and a lot of involvement of the private sector because they very much need to be involved. But it is, I think there is awareness. It's not under the radar in the sense that there is awareness that the forums are insufficient, but we're not quite there yet in terms of having those mechanisms of engagement.
Thank you. Madame Masson, 90 seconds.
Ms. Lapointe had sort of asked a little bit about what I was going to ask. So, and I'm totally going to pun this out, but I want to drill down a little bit more on that resource extraction. I couldn't help myself. It's the coffee. Just in terms of, and Dr. Steer, maybe you can talk about this in terms of the U.S.-led Artemis Accords on this and that potential extraction, resource extraction interests that the Americans are leading. Are the Artemis Accords different? What should Canada be concerned about in that regard on resource extraction?
Yeah, so I think Michael's right that the Outer Space Treaty left it a little bit open to interpretation. It is prohibited to appropriate in space. If you ask any country where other countries or companies have come in to take their natural resources, they will say that is appropriation. There are debates as to whether or not the Artemis Accords themselves are perhaps, some countries would say, a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. The US has simply said it is our interpretation of the treaty that space mining is lawful and will take place. So any country that has signed on to the Artemis Accords has thereby agreed with that definition, which includes Canada. It includes Australia. Australia is one of just, I think, 3 countries that have signed both the Artemis Accords and also the 1979 Moon Agreement, in which it said no entity can own any part of the moon, and that if space mining is about to take place, we need to have an international regulatory regime in place. There are discussions ongoing at the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. There are 3 or 4 different regimes, and China and Russia have their own alternative regimes. So we just don't quite know what the outcome is going to be.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bazan, 3 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to follow up quickly on a couple of things. One, first of all, if you look at RadarSat and the use of it in Ukraine, and as a member of the government back in 2015, we had rigorous debate on whether or not to provide RadarSat images to Ukraine in 2015, and made that decision, which I was proud to be part of. In 2016, of course, the government of the day under Stéphane Dion as foreign minister, the Liberals canceled that, which was directly seen as a reset or an appeasement of Putin. And then for 6 years, we argued from the Conservative side that we should reinstate that, which finally happened under Minister Annan, National Defense, and something that we applaud. But it is necessary to have that intelligence gathering capability so Ukraine knows what's happening on their doorstep. Now, when talking about RadarSat, our understanding is that National Defense only has one dedicated satellite to ISR, to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And I asked this to both, I know Dr. Steer, you work directly with the Department of National Defense. Mr. Byers, you from a NORAD perspective have been studying this issue for a long time. But should Canada supply for our own Arctic sovereignty, but also to our NORAD relationship, do we need to have more dedicated ISR satellites? And I'll start with Dr. Steer and then Dr. Byer.
I would say yes, Canada does need more sovereign ISR satellites. At the same time, Canada benefits from being part of CISPO, the Combined Space Operations, which started as a Five Eyes alliance, but now includes Germany, France, Italy, and Japan. And that is about sharing intelligence, space-based intelligence. Canada is a middle-sized economy, it's a middle power. It can't do everything. No country can do everything on its own in space these days. I also think that space technology collaboration can be used as a policy lever for other interests. But when it comes to ISR needs in particular, yes, Canada needs more dedicated sovereign capability, but it also can continue to benefit from that international partnership.
And also, from a standpoint of NORAD, particularly the Canadian relationship with NORAD and how we can bring space-based ISR satellites into that conversation.
Yeah, if I could just add, we do have RadarSat Constellation. I focus my comments on RadarSat 2 because it's a commercial satellite, but we do have 3 very capable radar satellites that are owned by the Canadian Space Agency and essentially tasked by the Department of National Defense. I presume that they're involved in supporting Ukraine also, but I've been focused on the issue of a commercial company providing support to frontline operations because that raises some really complex issues that need to be addressed by policy, as you've indicated was done after the annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Mr. Brazan, just in a final few seconds here. Over the course of this study, I've been concerned about the dual use of this technology, particularly that it's largely directed to commercial use, but with sometimes incidental military use. Occasionally that's reversed. But behind all of this technology and behind all of these companies are sometimes individuals who make erratic decisions, to put it generously. I don't think I need to elaborate with Mr. Musk, but we did see that Mr. Bezos, with his Blue Origin technology, had an interview with Mr. Trump, and shortly thereafter, the Wall Street Journal didn't publish their opinion. of course, that's not connected. I would be interested in your thoughts because we have got ourselves into a hugely dependent upon a very small group of individuals, which has created a vulnerability for all of our nations. I'd be interested in your reflections on that vulnerability.
If I could start, I would say I think Elon Musk is an outlier. I mean, other countries' commercial space companies don't have a monopoly over orbits, don't have the richest man in the world at their helm who's having essentially state visits internationally. So he's a bit of an outlier. But I think that means we need...
But a very important outlier.
Absolutely. And that's why Canada needs to then decide, well, to what extent do we want our nation to be dependent on Starlink as a specific capability? Because it helps in connecting remote communities, for example. But what could Canada be putting in place to make sure that it does not become reliant on a capability provided by an outlier individual? I think the commercialization of space is not only inevitable, we've passed the Rubicon on saying, well, do we want to engage with commercial actors? It's just the way it is. 75% of systems globally are commercially provided. The D&D buys commercial services, and that is going to continue to increase. So rather than question whether we want that relationship, we have to look at what the implications are. I mentioned the workshop that we held in Ottawa last month, and there'll be a report coming out that delves into these issues in great detail and identifies further areas for further research. So I'd be more than happy to simply pass that report on to Andrew or to the chair.
That would be very beneficial, and I see Dr. Byers is itching to get in on this question.
Yeah. The Canadian government gave Telesat an extra $1 billion for its Lightspeed constellation very shortly after Elon Musk limited Starlink coverage in the Black Sea, thus compromising the ability of the Ukrainian military to target the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. I connect those two developments. I think the Canadian government acted responsibly. We need our own sovereign communications constellation, and Telesat and MDA are building that for us right now. So the answer is yes, we do need to reduce our dependency on large companies, especially those led by mercurial, inconsistent people like Mr. Musk. But we've started that response already, and I look forward to Telesat Lightspeed filling a big gap and providing us with that increased security and dependency.
Yeah, here.
Much. I want to, on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you both for this absolutely fascinating conversation. A little spooky, that's right. Yes, on Halloween. Yes, well, none of us are going to dress up as space assets, though. Though I have to say that occasionally I think the opposition is from outer space. With that, I just again want to thank you. This has been very helpful, and Dr. Byers, A, good to see you again, but B, glad to see that the caffeination really cut in and you articulated your positions quite well. So with that, colleagues, we'll adjourn and go and visit our friends from Finland.
Thank you so much.